Hey guys, my name is John Park, and welcome to another session of tutorials. Today, for today's demonstration, I kind of wanted to do something a little bit more fun and less, crazy design oriented. And I want to get back on doing some more painterly techniques. So for today's theme, I'm gonna do some samurai armor, but to give it a little bit of our own twist, it's going to be samurais with machine guns. So it's a little funky, but I've always wanted to try something like that. And yeah, let's get started. So typically I do have two different points of reference. So one is referring to the armor, because there's so much complexity in the samurai armor. And the other one is actually more of the pose and kind of the machine gun aspect that we're going to heavily reference for our illustration here today. So what I like to do is I'll actually like to get started with just a little bit of color in mind, and the color that I'm thinking about is maybe something just a little bit more on the warmer kind of value. And just so that you guys are in clear of kind of my canvas ratio, is I usually work around 4,000 pixels in width. I'm sorry, 4,000 pixels on the largest side, and usually whatever it is in terms of height is going to be kind of the varying size. So 4,000 is something that, since we are working portrait, I want to go 4,000 as high. If I was going landscape, I'd go 4,000 wide. So that's kind of the way I like to work. It is relatively a fairly big file, and for concept art or illustration or whatnot, I mean, I try not to go a little bit too far, above that, just because then it starts to get into a really heavy kind of, memory range. So I'm gonna do a little bit of underpainting, and that's just kind of getting some splash of color in, just to get the thing started. So this is our underpainting layer. And typically, a lot of times we'll actually work off of our underpainting to get color information, also just maybe some things like composition that we might have in mind. So we have kind of this soldier concept, but I'm thinking it might be cool if since this guy is samurai, maybe he's more in kind of this woodsy type of area. So I'm just sketching this on a separate layer so that we can go and just kind of refine some of the lines here. And I want to keep this relatively loose. One thing we don't want to do is really heavily define the forest. We want to keep it relatively more interpretive and loose for what we're trying to do here. And getting a little bit of some cooler values here. I don't know if this is something that I absolutely want or need, but just something to kind of just think about as we're building our composition here. And now I'm gonna heavily reference this pose because this is just a cool pose, So what I like to do is oftentimes I'll actually use the silhouette because it's so freaking cool. And the thing is like, that's all I'm really using. I mean, you can actually paint or copy it, but you know what? For the purpose of this kind of exercise and what I'm trying to do, I'd rather just kind of work smarter and not harder. And that doesn't necessarily mean like, oh yeah, let's just not try to find ways to paint, but let's try to be a little bit efficient with our time and try to figure out what ways we can actually start just getting things down on paper without having to spend an extra hour. So a lot of times when I do my character work, I'll actually use photographs. and I'm sure for those of you who've seen my tutorials, it's typically kind of the way I like to kind of get things started with a lot of my paintings. And then from here, I'm just gonna get in just a little bit of color, and I'm thinking about kind of this more reddish tone for our character here, even the bits of the weapon here. And then I'm gonna start referencing some of these samurai armor. And it's cool because, again, this is something that I definitely want to put on top of our character. So I might even just try to see if we can match the silhouette. Let's go ahead and copy this, just so that you guys can see the before and after. But I'm going to use the colors here to then just kind of loosely sketch the overall concept. And it's crazy cool because it's already starting to feel like it's matching a lot of the silhouette and the forms. And again, for this instance, guys, I want you guys to just sketch with a medium to large brushstrokes, okay? Anything small is going to maintain in the details. So that's something that I want you guys to just keep in mind as we're doing our initial sketch phase. So I'm going to work with medium to large brushstrokes. The reason being is because I just want to make sure that the forms and everything are relatively, reading very well. And if I'm color picking, I'm going to color pick, but I don't want to mark it down because those are two completely different colors. I want to kind of glaze it just a little bit and see what kind of colors are influenced when I mix the two together. So I'm getting kind of like a really warm but more brownish tone of our armor. And I definitely want kind of more of the armor bits to have a little bit of a cooler tone as well. I love working this way just because, we're purely focusing on color, composition, and just the overall, the exercising our painting brain. And maybe even getting some of those marks. These little things, and notice how loose I'm being with the information, because I want to make sure that it looks good. I want to make sure that it kind of has the right elements. But for the most part, I'm trying to keep it relatively loose with large brush strokes. Maybe we can go a little bit darker here. Pants. Now there's things like, the pants where we can get a little bit more stylized and kind of put in our own form here. It's such a weird combination. As I'm looking at it more and more, it's like, what in the hell? What kind of dimension are we in? We're like in nonsensical land right now. But yeah, now it's just like, let's pay attention to just some of the costume design motifs and really look at how things are distributed in terms of the materials, the graphic shapes, the patterns, all that stuff, It's what's going to allow our sketch to have the right and very, fairly accurate pieces. Again, large brush strokes. And you can see it coming together really quickly. I mean, it's starting to feel like, it has that kind of vibe of samurai soldier or something. Samurais with machine guns. some really great reference for guys who are very painterly. Obviously, one of my favorites is Craig Mullins, Jamie Jones. But if you guys want to look at guys who implement a very painterly look and feel, oftentimes I actually use a lot of classical illustrators. Some of the more 19th century, 18th century illustrations, because those guys actually had a lot of work that showed a beautiful range of brush economy, and they just had such a nice kind of look and aesthetic to their work. So that's something that I'll probably consider adding or looking at, especially when I'm doing this type of stuff. So continuing on with this painting here, I'm gonna just put in some of the motifs here on the costume, and again, keeping in mind large brush strokes. Let's see here, getting some of the nice little bits of gold. I might even color pick from my background just to indicate that. Now I have kind of this from the previous army guy pose, and when we're keeping in mind composition, we obviously want to frame it so it looks interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm actually going to scale it up just so that the composition, it takes a bigger and better composition of the page. I think there's something about it that feels just a little too stiff in just the way it's kind of being arranged. So I'm just gonna kind of bump it up a little bit. And the background here as well, let's just go ahead and add a little bit to it. And I want to definitely frame this character up against the background here. And maybe the background can be more of a kind of bamboo type of setting. And remember, keep the brush strokes relatively in the mid to large range. Definitely don't want to get too caught up in the details. It's gonna cool down the background here just a bit. I think another thing that might help is just adding a little bit of a ground here. So on this layer, I'm actually gonna go ahead and start defining, and depending on like what kind of, whether it's mud or snow, I definitely want to start establishing that. Maybe snow might be really neat. Alright, so maybe just adding a little bit of kind of a ground here or something, just so it kind of feels a little bit more so the ground doesn't feel like boring. So we can add just a little bit of composition just even on the ground. So I know the character's foot is up, and even in this photo, like maybe the ground was going up, so that's even something that we could even consider too. Maybe the ground here, the ground plane of this is actually building up. So just to emphasize that, maybe we add just a little bit of a uphill slant. And again, broad brush strokes. If you need to load, put the flow down, just to get some of the nice transitions here. But the way I always think about painting, guys, is like, you know, it's like we're working with the camera, and because we're working with something that's very camera-like, you know, we're gonna get a lot of areas in focus and a lot of areas that are defocused. So that's kind of what I'm always thinking about is what's in our focal focus and what's not in our focus. So okay, maybe add just a little bit of color here, and I'm just thinking about like color washes as well. Something that we can just kind of start to think about and implement here. Okay, cool. All right, let's continue with the actual samurai guy. You know what helps too is, like, let's say you guys are trying to figure out, like, well, right now we have a yellowish scene. How does it all fit with all the reds and stuff like that? Because this is clearly an image that's in a studio lighting. So how do we get it to fit in that tone? One thing I always like to do is if your colors tend to be if they're not in the right temperature, always put kind of the general majority color here on a separate layer and actually put that on soft light. Tends to work, or even sometimes overlay. Okay, you know, you always want to kind of try it out and see what fits, and notice how the reds are a lot more sharper and the black tones are a lot more warmer. So this is something that I always try out, you know, to see if it fits. And I'm just gonna kind of lighten this up and darken down just a little bit. And look at the blues here. The blues before were a lot bluer in the image, and now as I put this soft light on, it's very, very green, right? So that's something to keep note of. Like anything that's in the blue range of our image, it's gonna now look and appear very green. So I'm just gonna go ahead and continue to paint this stuff in. And I'm always kind of switching up, you know, brushes, just kind of give a little bit of variation, and just thinking about you know, the different textures that I can actually showcase. Might even want to add just a little bit of color back there. And doing these little studies are always fun because it's like, you know, the single thing that I'm most focusing on is kind of the brush economy, and looking at the image, thinking about how I can actually get kind of the two to mesh together, but more importantly, how can I convey all that I need with just a matter of a few strokes. Because there's a time to be an illustrator and there's a time to be a concept artist, and in this time I'm mainly going to focus on my illustration abilities and see what I can actually learn in this process. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of soften this edge a little bit and start to define maybe just a little bit of the helmet. I'm going to see what it looks like up close, and it looks like it's kind of more of kind of this, like, you know, ornamental kind of stuff here. but I kind of like the vagueness of what I have, so I'm going to leave just parts of it slightly more obscure and abstract. Okay. Again, medium to large size brush strokes, and then when we get into the details, that's when we'll actually start focusing on the smaller brush strokes. Okay, one thing that I always find myself, getting too ahead of is putting too many smaller brush strokes, and it starts to get really stiff very quickly. And I'm going to go ahead and make any modifications that I need to in order to get kind of the pose of all this guy to feel and fit the environment a little bit better. And obviously it's very much very subtle, very little incremental amounts, but okay. I have this like huge, there's like really big armor that these samurai guys have. So maybe that's something that I can actually probably even bump up a little bit more. And here's something I'm going to start doing is, once I get a lot of my local colors, even though it's kind of like in this red tone, I want to start influencing it with some of this cooler value. Just to kind of give a little bit of a nice visual clarity of like what is a hard edge, what is detail, and all that stuff. So this is where once we're ready, then we can get into some of the details here and start to define a lot of this stuff right here. And I'm gonna rotate my brushes as needed to do that, to get some nice edges here. If there's anything that's hard to do, it's always getting nice clean edges. I kind of like the fact that it vignettes and it kind of gets a bit lost here, and I really want to retain that. That's something that we want to try to maintain and have in our paintings. Okay. All right. Okay. Now I think we're at a fairly decent phase to start thinking about detail or more additional detail. Let's just add in just a bit more stuff that I might have left out on. I'm either constantly color picking or using the difference between my background and some of the colors and values of my background, just to kind of get the right color. Now we got this machine gun, right? It's kind of obviously very much just a copy, the exact photo. But if we want to make it our own, this is where we take the opportunity to do so. So maybe in this case, what I can do is kind of add our own flair. And based on our reference or research, maybe maybe I can add something that gives it a little bit of a uniqueness that feels very much like, oh yeah, that's totally a samurai machine gun. And maybe what that might be is maybe a sword or just some decorative elements. Maybe just a combination of the two. I definitely like a lot of the ornamental details here as well that's on the actual samurai armor. And if we can get that just in our medium stroke of detail, then I'm going to try to convey that, even if it's a blob of color. And even some of this stuff too, just a little tassels that hang down. This is just like really neat. And maybe we can get just a little bit of movement. And just from even from the weapon itself, maybe maybe we can get a little bit of like some sort of fabric or something. I don't know if that looks right. Yeah, there's something really neat about that. Maybe it's just a strap that kind of comes down in vignettes of something. Another cool thing is samurai swords, right? Maybe we can put that in as an idea. I mean, if it gets too overly complicated, then it's something that we can always put in later or not have to put in, but just to kind of make the image more interesting is what I'm always after. Maybe not samurai armor, but maybe like an ammo pouch is what makes more sense. Okay, but keep in mind the broad strokes. Again, I'm so tempted, even when I do these illustrations or these little studies, I'm always so tempted to jump into detail that it's just like my brain wants to like hurry up and like just get into the the fun nitty gritty stuff. But I know that a lot of the bulk of the work, or bulk of the image here, is actually can be figured out at this phase. You know, it's just about getting all your fundamental structures down and making sure that this stuff looks and feels you know, accurate. Okay, now I'm starting to get into a little bit of detail here. Now where I'm gonna place my detail is mainly gonna be here, so I'm gonna put the most amount of, you know, contrast, but also just brush strokes there, just to convey that. Okay. So this is where, you know, the opportunity to zoom in is definitely okay, and this is the time to do it. And then again, we talked about bringing some of the light of this background into our image, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and I'm gonna put this on really low flow and just kind of glaze, ever so lightly glaze on the top sides of where I know for a fact that it's receiving this kind of color or light. Okay, let's do that. That's not bad. Okay. Continuing on with the details, since we got a lot of the colors in. I'm gonna go ahead and add just those marks. Now again, like, I'm probably not gonna zoom in anything past this point, just because it'll help me to think about the shape, but also just the mark itself. The mark is something that's very important to me, because, you know, it's what's going to give it that nice illustrative quality. The marksmanship, the brush economy. Just put down marks just right in some of the in some of the areas here, define some of the hard edge, but also I still want to keep some areas where it's slightly a little bit more of a lost edge, and I just kind of want to play with some of those rhythms, the rhythms of like lost and found. You'll hear me say that often, and for those of you who are just learning this stuff, because I've recently, you know, learned, you know, some of these principles. You know, it's probably something I've been doing intuitively, but to really learn and understand it, it was kind of an eye-opening experience. So, you know, in terms of lost and found edges, it's just like areas of like where things are very, very clear and just kind of, you know, there's no real interpretation. It's just very clear. And areas where it's lost is more of like, you know, your eyes can't really quite make out the detail, but with two elements side by side is where you can really make out the detail in the image. Add just a little bit of a warm value here, maybe getting a bit of light being influenced up from the ground. The great thing about this is that, you know, I'm actually picking and choosing what I want to put in. You know, especially for some of the armor bits. Let's go ahead and switch to the soft brush here, because at a certain point, you know, aesthetically there's going to be, if we use one brush too much, then it's going to start, you know, showing the same sort of texture over and over again. So this is a good opportunity to kind of switch over to another brush, just to kind of help us think about, like, you know, varying textures, but also just the object itself, how it reads. And I love this plated look. This is such a really cool kind of aesthetic. There's this plated bit. Maybe in just some of the areas I can make it and give it just a little bit of a different kind of form here. Just adding just a little bit of a cool tone here. Now I'm going to go in here and just start defining some more hard edges here. Because again, this is the stuff that's going to allow us to understand, like, you know, that there is a really clearly defining object here. And it's always nice to see something that's defined and then like kind of lost, and then something defined and then lost. So I'm always kind of balancing and juggling the two. I want to kind of look at how I can introduce maybe even some texture here. And I'm gonna do this very, very sparingly. I just want to see, you know, what I can actually do to kind of help bump up some detail, but also just stuff like this right here. Even though I know this is out of our focal range, which it is, I just want to see if it can help kind of give it a little bit of a suggestive detail without spelling it out too much. So I'm gonna add this here, and as I add this on top, I'm gonna put this on a soft light, and I'm gonna dial it down so it matches the same value. I'm just gonna go ahead and put a mask on it and just kind of reveal just some bits. And all I really want is just a little bit of some of that segment, because at this point it allows me to understand how I can interpret this in terms of a really loose yet suggestive kind of brush stroke. You see that? That's all I really want from it. It's just to give me some idea of how I can handle that area. I know it seems like a lot of work just to kind of get that one area to kind of feel like it's has the right materials, but I mean honestly that's kind of what the extent of how I'm using those textures. I just wanted to give me just a little bit of a hint, because sometimes, like, you know, photos, what they give us is they give so much information, but a lot of times, you know, that's we don't want to just purely bank on, you know, the preciseness of the information, like every single detail, but we definitely want some sort of accuracy of whether it's the right type of information. Tassels, lost edge, that's cool. I have a hard edge here. I'll probably want to get a little bit of a slightly more undefined lost edge here. Maybe just a little bit of a slight shadow. Maybe some reflected light from the background. And I got this piece here. You guys are probably wondering, like, what the heck? That's straight up just texture that's gonna fit. But I'm gonna do the same thing. Put this on soft light and just kind of use some of the textural information to see what I can do to kind of bump up some suggestive details. And then I'm going to go on top of it to paint and loosen some of that information. Yeah, and there you go. It's kind of like, you know, it's kind of a way to do a study, but also your own kind of concept mixed in with, you know, a photo reference from a soldier, and it's just kind of this hybrid of different things. again, conceptually, this isn't anything like where I know for a fact that I'm not really pushing, you know, but compositionally and in terms of the illustrative quality, it's something that I definitely am trying to emphasize and just think about more the painting and the composition and the lighting. Do that. Make sure we have a nice hard edge here. Just for our armor bit. And as we zoom in, you can kind of see the amount of complexity we're creating just in this area. Now I'm going to add in another layer here, which are these little buckles of detail. And as they transition from this top side, probably going to get a little bit of a lighter face. So that's what we're going to do here. Add in some more detail. Okay. And then from there, let's go ahead and add a little bit of a highlight just to a couple of these guys. So I don't want to go highlighting and defining all of them, you know. We kind of still want our viewer to kind of look at it as, you know, suggestive detail. Get some of that hard edge right there. And I'm going to use just a little bit of this light to kind of define just some highlights here on some of my armor bits. And I'm going to do it very sparingly. Make it even a selection here. I'm going to hide that selection and just kind of see what I can do to kind of just give it a slight bit of texture, but like a lit surface. Some areas are going to get a little bit more light than other areas because these are little they're plates that are moving, or that are not moving, sorry, that are slightly shifted, and because of that, some is going to get a little bit more light than others. So just like this one here, this one definitely is catching a lot more light than all this other stuff here. Now the thing about like Japanese armor, everything is like really stiff. like the plates of information, like all of the paneling tends to be very like cardboardy, kind of stiff. So I mean, honestly, we can probably even just get away with this being just a shape. The other thing is, like, you know, I probably want to make sure that if this is overlapping, then, you know, we're going to have a shadow here. Or if this is overlapping, then let's clearly make it so that it's overlapping that panel. So we have to define one or the other. So since this is being overlapped by this shape, then let's make a slight shadow here, or an indication of a shadow, I would say. Let's get some suggested plates. I'm going to use this edge here. It has a really defined edge on one side and a really soft on another side. So this is good for us to kind of get a bit of a nice segmented look just on that. Get some more of that light influence there. Even looking at some of our reference here, like this guy's getting a lot of light on the shoulder and down here in just pockets of area. So, you know, we can do the same exact thing where we really want to show off where those pockets of light are. So I'm going to create another new layer here and actually just kind of try to hit some of those little lit areas. I'm just gonna erase away some of this stuff here. I know there's a slight tangent here, so I'm probably gonna most likely want to just kind of blend or erase part of this out and just push it out of the frame and let it kind of return so it doesn't feel like it's cropped in a weird way. See where else we can put some of those highlights. Maybe even just on some of the folds here, without getting too heavy. Now it's starting to feel fairly detailed, right? Because we're starting to really define some of the edges using soft and hard edges. But more importantly, we're doing it in just an area, in just one area where we want our eyes to focus and dial in on. Probably gonna just redo this part of the nozzle in the gun and make it a little bit more sketchy and less defined from the photo. Now we do have the hand that's supposed to be here, and I realized as I was drawing this armor, I was like, oops, probably pushed out the hand a little too far. So we're gonna just bring that back, and I want to get kind of the same surface that tells us like that's a hand. And again, anytime you guys do details, always start off with very broad brushstrokes. It's gotta read at a very broad information before we get into any details, right? Clean up the silhouette there a little bit. Alright, now let's go back to our reference and just kind of see if there's anything else that we're missing in terms of design detail. There's this back part right here that I really wanted to implement, which was some of this motif, but we're gonna use just kind of, instead of the dots, we're just gonna use kind of the looser brush strokes, and maybe just a patch here of that. But then I definitely want to get some of these little brackets to kind of show up. And just get a little bit of an edge here. Just gonna highlight a little bit of this. And again, only using broad strokes. Maybe a little bit of a highlight on the top of this. Okay, so that's looking pretty cool. I mean, that's, if we look at kind of where we started at, we have 1, right, 2, we bumped up the size, and then now we're starting to detail pass. So you can see that a lot of the attention went here, and it's really starting to kind of pull in together fairly nicely. Okay, now let's just kind of define a little bit of the headdress part right here, this edge. Just a little bit, so it's not like completely, you know, 2 brush strokes and calling it a day. Okay. What I'm gonna do next is I'm just gonna look up some imagery on maybe a bamboo type setting, just to see if there's some shapes. Bamboo forest, to see if there's some shapes or anything that we can actually pull and integrate into our scene. I mean, like, look at that. That is so cool. There's a lot of interesting bits and pieces here. So I'm gonna probably pull this into our image here, as well as maybe just some other things that are very bamboo like, you know, some of these tree patterns, or even kind of the leaves here are quite nice. Going to introduce that as well, along with this. Alright, cool. So why I picked these is because I like some of the shapes and things that are going on, but more importantly, I want to use just some of the textural detail to get into our background. And when I say textural, it's just kind of more the some of the negative shapes and things that we see here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab this image, and I'm going to go to Image, Adjustment, and I'm going to Match Color, and I'm going to try to get it in line with our samurai soldier, and I'm going to try to find a background that really fits. Now this is quite nice. It definitely works, but I want more of the color and less of this kind of contrast. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna create a layer, select this color, apply it. I'm gonna put it on color mode, and I'm actually going to back it off just a little bit and use this as a base. Now again, this is something that I want. I just want the shapes. That's kind of my goal here, is to get the shapes here to read, and I'm gonna put it on lighten because I want those shapes, and that's all I really care for. And once I get those high contrast shapes, then I can start to, you know, get a more of a defined kind of background, and that's kind of where I'm gonna create a mask, and you'll see me here just revealing just some areas. Where we can get light to seep through. Let's go ahead and I'm going to copy merge all this so I can actually paint. And I'm going to go ahead and actually blend and smudge out some of the details here, because I don't need everything to be like perfectly crisp. I just need an impression, because this is supposed to be a very fairly impressionistic kind of feel of our scene. I don't know if I want that to be open or maybe just closed. Maybe he's in the thick of the forest, but we'll kind of play with that. I'm going to do the same thing. Maybe just grab a bit of this here. Create a layer. Put it on kind of this yellowish tone and put it on color mode. I'm going to back it off just a tad bit. And that way I have some shapes to work with. I'll put it here, and now I can start to really get a sense of just some more shape bits and elements. Now this is fairly contrasty because a lot of my tones back here are a lot more lighter in value, so I'm gonna actually paint bucket and put this on lighten and try to get this to kind of help knock back a lot of the contrast that's been created back here. And again, I'm going to compress this down, create a a little mask, and I'm just gonna only reveal what I need. Because again, I don't need everything. I just need just some details to help me define some areas. Because I definitely want it to be interpretive in some of these other zones. So let's compress that down. Okay, now I'm going to actually go and paint in and break up some of the shapes here, and also keeping in mind the loose painterly nature of it. I'm going to actually hand paint back some of these highlights and bits. Now we can get a better sense of our entire scene. Now we're like, okay, cool. Things are reading fairly well. There's a couple of things that I probably want to do to really push the image, and that's probably add a little bit more contrast to this bit of the gun. Might even extend the canvas a bit. Take out cropped so we don't lose everything here. The only reason why I'm extending it out is so that I can get just a little bit more breathing room, and also it's a way for me to say, you know, I want to extend the tip of this gun to get a more of a sword-like silhouette here. It's very similar to kind of what they had, like, you know, back in the olden days with like muskets and stuff. Add in just a really soft kind of shadow on the same character layer here. Okay, I'm going to compress everything. So now that we have our image here, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of blur out some of this stuff here. Add maybe just a little bit of this light. Have it kick up on the tassels, and maybe just a little bit on the armor here. Okay. I'm actually going to go ahead and kind of blend out the background just a little bit here. Get some more cooler tones. I want to simplify some of this stuff too, because it is getting a little bit noisy. And just keep in mind some of these shapes here too. As I simplify, just want to make sure that there's a nice distribution of shape and weight here. So I'm actually using color dodge to kind of help alleviate some of the smaller details here. And I'm just going to use this to kind of push it back just a tad bit. Even stuff like this, like I can actually use this, use a little low contrast here. Alright, I think that pretty much does it, guys. This is kind of the extent of this demo here, and I hope you guys enjoyed my Painterly techniques demonstration. Obviously, as I'm showing you guys this, I'm also learning, you know, myself. I'm not by any means a master of this stuff. I'm still heavily looking at, you know, what other guys do, and I just want to share you guys my process. And if you guys have any questions at all, please do not, you know, be shy. You know, feel free to email me or ask me. You know, I love to hear what you guys think of the demo, and more importantly, I love to kind of see what you guys produce. Yeah. So thank you again, and thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.